That's all good.
Good.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to a virtual Raglan. It's like Mr. Lawson's in a real Raglan though, looking at the back of his photograph. I'm not in San Francisco. What we have done is put that screen behind just simply so that folk can sort of readily identify the panel members if they're talking and asking a question. We've sort of old hands at this. This is our fourth Zoom hearing. Hopefully the technology and so forth is going to work okay for everybody. What we would ask people to do is if they're not actively involved in a particular part of the proceedings, e.g. they're just listening and waiting for their turn, if they could just turn their audio off, which it looks like most of you have done anyway. It just makes the sound quality better and stops reverb and things like that we can occasionally experience. So we run these hearings exactly as we would if we were actually all present in the same room. It's just that we're not in the same room, obviously. The procedure's the same as what we've been running at our other hearings. I think all the people here, or most of the people here, certainly the residents from Raglan, haven't been in any of our hearings thus far, but they're reasonably streamlined affairs, and by that we mean that all the information that's been circulated has been pre-read, and we're asking folk to give us a quick summary of what their views are, and more importantly, what it is they're seeking us to do, and we're limiting that to about 10 minutes. With the exception of the reporting officers, because they've got to report on what everybody said, whereas everybody else only has to talk about themselves. So we're still encouraging efficiency, but we're not going to be over the top about all of that. So the way that the proceedings work is that the council staff and their advisors summarise their information first. We then go through the submitters one by one. We then usually give the reporting officer the opportunity just to see whether anything that's been said during the course of the day has changed their view on anything, just so that we're aware of that. And at the end of each person's presentation, the panel will ask whatever questions they want to ask. They're really only for us to clarify what people might be meaning if we're not clear what it is that's been said, or whether we don't understand something or want a bit more information about something. So I think without further ado, it's probably worthwhile everyone just turning their microphones on briefly, and we just go around the room and everyone can identify themselves, just so that everybody knows who's in the room. I think most people will know me. Phil Mitchell is my name, so I won't say anything more. I don't think we need introductions about, you know, name, rank and serial number type stuff. It's just simply a name and the organisation that you're representing, if in fact it is an organisation. So perhaps we do the panel first and then the submitters and staff. Well, sorry, the panel, staff, and then the submitters one by one.
Yes, good morning everyone. Paul Cooney's my name. I'm on a panel member.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Linda Tiaho and I'm a panel member too.
And I'm Jan Sedgwick and I'm a panel member.
Hi, I'm Suki Singh and I'm just assisting the panel.
Morning everybody, I'm Sandra Kelly. I'm the Senior Project Coordinator, District Plan.
Good morning everybody, my name's Summer Salmon. I'm the Council Planner and author of the Section 42A report.
Morena, I'm Carolyn Rett, Planner Assistant Council.
Good morning, my name's Will Gauntlet. I'm working with Carolyn, Summer and the crew, and am here as an observer today.
Thank you.
Morning everybody, my name's Brad Coombs. I work for ISMIS. I've been helping Waikato District Council with a character study for Raglan.
Thanks, Mr. Coombs.
Hi, Benjamin and Isabel Wheeler. We are submitted.
Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler. We've seen you before. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
If you wouldn't, yeah, that's right, you've got your microphone off. Thank you. Mr. Stickney's about to fail the technology test, but he's come back to life.
I've come back to life. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name's Phil Stickney, planner at Becker. I'm presenting evidence on behalf of Kāinga Ora this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Stickney. I think you're live, Mr. Lawson, according to my screen.
Yep. I'm John Lawson, representing Whangaroa Environmental Defence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson. All right, I think that's everybody. Well, welcome everyone. We'll just carry on as per what I just said before. If for whatever reason there's something that has gone haywire, just wave your arms around or something, and we'll intervene. All right, Ms. Salmon, I think we can just start with you. If you can take us through your highlights of your report, please, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to the panel and submitters. As I've mentioned, my name is Summer Salmon, and I'm the author of the Section 42A report and rebuttal evidence for Raglan. I've prepared a statement which provides an overview of the notified provisions relating to Raglan, the submissions, the recommended amendments to the notified plan, and the remaining matter of addressing Raglan's special character. The key provisions pertinent to Raglan within the notified version include provisions within Chapter 1, which recognise the ecological and cultural importance of the coastline and various landmarks, including Karioi. Provisions within Chapter 4, which seek to ensure a wide range of housing options are provided for within towns, including Raglan. To ensure residential zoned land near the business town centre zone and transport networks is used for higher density residential living. To provide for the ongoing change in the mixture of residential and commercial activities bordering identified commercial areas within the Bankart Street and Wainui Road overlay area. To recognise and maintain the role and scale of the business town centres to ensure their continued viability, to promote business town centres as a community focal point and maintain their commercial and mixed use character, and to maintain and enhance the role of the Raglan Town Centre. Further, a provision within Chapter 6 seeks to avoid obscuring the sightline of the Raglan navigation beacons. Provisions within Chapter 9, which outline controls to ensure the development of the Rangitahi Peninsula is of a character and scale that reflects the harbour setting and Raglan's seaside village character. Rules within Chapter 16 relating to commercial activities within the Bankart Street and Wainui Road business overlay area. Rules within Chapters 16, 17, 18, 22 and 25 relating to the Raglan navigation beacons. Rules within Chapter 28 relating to the Rangitahi Peninsula Zone, Appendix 8, which contains the Rangitahi Structure Plan, and Appendix 10.1, which contains the Raglan Town Centre Character Statement. Activities within Raglan are otherwise governed by the General Zone rules. In terms of the submissions addressed, the Section 42A report addresses 94 original submission points and 101 further submission points. The submissions cover a range of matters, including the protection of the character of Raglan, a structure plan for Raglan, the notification of resource consent applications failing district plan provisions, the Raglan Town Centre, the built environment outside of the town centre, restrictions on holiday accommodation in Raglan, the protection of views to the harbour, coast and natural backdrops, the Raglan navigation beacons and beach access for horses. A number of the submissions considered that Raglan has a special character and sought inclusion of provisions in the district plan to protect that character. The relief sought in some of the submissions is extensive, although often not specific to a particular provision, while other submissions do not go beyond stating that the character of Raglan needs to be protected. ISMIS was contracted by Council to determine as a first step whether there is or is not special character in Raglan. Their analysis considered that there are specific characteristics and attributes which contribute to the special character of Raglan and its surrounds. In terms of the identified aspects of character that can be measured and interpreted, the notified provisions do not fully protect those elements, as there are very few provisions in the district plan unique to Raglan. In terms of the more intrinsic aspects of character, I agree with Mr. Coombs that more engagement is required with the community and in particular with mana whenua to enable development of a rule and policy framework. Although I support the submissions in principle, I find myself unable to recommend changes in response to their submissions on the basis that none of the submissions provided an analysis at a level of detail that corresponds to the scale and significance of the changes sought to the notified plan, and the result of accepting those submissions may significantly change the proposed plan without a real opportunity for participation by those who may be affected. And this is due to the lack of specificity in the relief being sought by the submissions. In my report, I suggested that the relief sought by submitters might be best served through a subsequent process. In terms of the recommended amendments to the notified version, as detailed in Appendix 2 of the Section 42A report, I have recommended 6 amendments to the notified version, specifically to Policy 4.5.14, which relates to the Raglan Town Centre, and to the prohibited activities rules within Chapters 16, 17, 18, 22, and 25, which relate to the Raglan navigation beacons. Policy 4.5.14 is notified, sets out the development principles within the Raglan Town Centre. In relation to new built form, the policy requires consistency with the outcomes of the Raglan Town Centre character statement, but it does not state what those outcomes are. The recommended amendments incorporate the outcomes of the character statement into the policy to provide more certainty about what the policy is trying to achieve, and in my opinion, strengthens the policy. With respect to the recommended amendments to the prohibited activities rules, these rules as notified prohibit activities that obscure the sightline of the Raglan navigation beacon, rather than prohibiting activities that breach the height restriction plane. There is a 1 metre buffer between the light and the height restriction plane, and so the wording of the rule currently allows land use activities to breach the height plane as long as they do not obscure the sightline of the beacons as a permitted activity. As such, I consider there's a risk of obscuring the sightline of the beacon light if the wording remains as is. As such, I recommended amended wording, which prohibits development that protrudes into the height restriction plane. This wording, in my view, reduces the risk of obscuring the sightline of the beacon and provides more certainty around the application of the rule, and also consistency in terms of the wording of these rules in relation to other similar notified rules. I understand that there is the intention to lift the beacon. However, this is a matter which needs to be addressed outside the district plan. In regard to the remaining matter of addressing Raglan's special character, in making the suggestion to address Raglan's special character through a plan change, I did weigh up whether a variation might be a more appropriate option. As I see it, the only difference between a variation and a plan change is the timing, in that one is a change to the proposed district plan while the other is a change to the operative district plan. Either process will address the submissions seeking protection of Raglan's character and allow the opportunity for participation with the wider community, albeit within the time constraints of this process if it were to be progressed as a variation. Once the plan is beyond challenge, activities within Raglan will be subject to the new rule and policy framework, ensuring the identified characteristics which contribute to the special character of Raglan are protected. Either process will mean there will be an interim period where activities within Raglan will be governed by the general plan provisions, but there will most likely be a longer period to incorporate provisions if this process were to be progressed as a plan change, unless of course the variation is appealed. As I have concluded already, these provisions will not fully protect the identified characteristics which contribute to the special character of Raglan. Because there are no time constraints for a plan change, this will enable full participation of affected parties, a deeper understanding of the elements that contribute to the character of Raglan, the recognition of the more intrinsic aspects of character within Raglan, the development of important community relationships, and the integration of relevant non-statutory and statutory drivers into a single process, which may eliminate the need for a future plan change. I'm aware of other submissions from Raglan seeking other outcomes such as enabling affordable housing, and the protection of character may conflict with achieving this. For this reason, I consider a Schedule 1 process to be an appropriate way forward. Taking this into account, I consider a plan change to be the more appropriate option. There are a number of other processes being undertaken concurrently by Council, such as the growth strategy and blueprints. A plan change would allow Council the time and resources to pull these processes together into one comprehensive engagement process and result in an integrated planning framework for Raglan. Whilst I can't give the panel or community certainty around the time frame for any plan change, I can confirm it will be prioritised alongside other district and strategic planning priorities. Thank you. That completes my summary, and I welcome any questions that the panel may have.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. I think what we might do is hear from Mr. Coombs first, because his material is sort of at the heart of a lot of what you've talked to us about. We do have some specific questions of you regarding things like the navigation beacon, which is something that we've been faced with in previous hearings, and some other matters of detail. But I think this character issue is sort of at the heart of a lot of what people are here to talk about.
Yes.
So I think we might just hear from Mr. Coombs first, and then we'll come back and ask questions of you both, although a lot of them will be directed probably to you because they relate to general matters that Mr. Coombs isn't talking to us about. So Mr. Coombs, if you could take us through your material, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now I have prepared a set of, well, what I've called notes, but essentially it's a summary statement. It's a summary of the character study and the process that we went through, along with some observations at the end. So I'm not sure if that's made it to the panel.
Yes, we have got that, thank you. And we also saw, we've also seen the one that Ms. Salmon read out before as well.
Okay, so I'll just take you through those notes initially then, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
So the purpose of the statement is to set out the background and rationale for the consideration of special character of Raglan for the hearing today. The Waikato District Council received submissions on the proposed plan that suggested that Raglan has a form of special character and was different from the balance of the Waikato District. On the basis of those submissions, the character should be identified and, where possible, protected through the proposed district plan to the extent that it can be. In response to the submissions, ISMIS were commissioned by the Council to assess the character of Raglan and to provide a report on whether Raglan has special character, and if so, what the broad characteristics of that character is. The limited time available allowed for some expert analysis of the character of Raglan and also one workshop to get submitters' feedback. So initially a series of maps were prepared at a range of scales to look at the various attributes of a place that would normally contribute to its character. So those attributes were all mapped and illustrated and described, so that the headings from the character study are the context of the surrounding landscape, the tangata whenua and historic significance, the underlying and surrounding topography, the relationship to water bodies, the extent of vegetation, patterns of land use, access and connectivity, grain layout and scale, and finally open spaces. So to a large extent, these attributes can be understood by spatial analysis, mapping, illustration, and description. But to better understand how these attributes contribute to the perception of the character of Raglan, a workshop was organised and facilitated by the Council and ISMIS, and that was held on Wednesday, the 11th of March, 2020. And the purpose was to engage the submitters and other interested parties on the character of Raglan. So submitters were directly invited to the workshop. Attendees at the workshop were invited to identify and locate special characteristics of Raglan, and in a second exercise, attendees were asked to identify and locate special characteristics from the list of the attributes that are listed out above. The information from the workshop was assimilated and added to the maps that were prepared under the attributes headings. And some attendees at the workshop also made more open or general statements about where Raglan and Whangaroa sit within the broader tribal and regional context. From that analysis and mapping of the attributes that contribute to the character and the information that was gathered at the workshop, it was assessed that Raglan does have a special character, and that character was identified and includes, I've got another list of bullet points here. So the strong visual and physical relationship between the township and the harbour, the coast and Mount Kareoi, the outward facing nature of the underlying landforms, the arrangement and layout of the township across the peninsulas that are connected up generally by causeways and bridges, the sinuous tree-lined coastal edge formed by the peninsulas, the human scale of development in Raglan Township, which provides a sense of openness within the settlement, the bowl-like topography within which both Raglan Township and Whangaroa Harbour are set, with the rising landform to the north, east and west, separating the catchment from other parts of the district. And finally, the relaxed and informal character of the settlement developed over years through limited development pressure and a fairly laid-back community and residents. So many of the special character attributes are intrinsic to Raglan and Whangaroa and the surrounding landscape context. For example, the relationship between the town, Whangaroa and Mount Kareoi results from its location and the underlying landforms and topography of the town and its wider context. These attributes are very unlikely to be affected by the provisions of a district plan to any great extent. They're simply part of the wider existing environment. These relationships could be explained or even accentuated by district plan provisions, but any resulting change to these relationships would be relatively subtle. Other attributes are more quantifiable or controllable through a district plan. For example, the arrangement and layout of the township, the tree-lined coastal edge, the human scale of development, and the relaxed and informal character of the settlement can be influenced by district plan provisions. Specific to these attributes of character, patterns of future urban development could be required to respect the underlying topography. Coastal edge trees could be protected, the scale of development could be controlled, and the relaxed and informal character of the town could be protected through a relaxation in urban and road design standards. And there were a series of footnotes in there, so I'll let you cast your eye over those towards the end. Design guidelines or protocols for precincts of Raglan could also help to stitch together the physical attributes that affect the character of the built form within the town. In addition to the combination of intrinsic and more quantifiable or controllable attributes of the special character, the workshop identified other historic and perceptual attributes that are less obvious and less accessible. For example, Tainui Awhiro identified an area of wider tribal landscape extending both northwards and southwards along the coast that is important to understanding Whangaroa for Tainui. Understanding this wider tribal landscape and an appropriate planning response to it will require further engagement with Tainui Awhiro than was achievable through a single workshop. In addition to the further engagement with Tainui Awhiro, some of the submitters, and in particular some that provided evidence on Chapter 16, have divergent views on what the character of Raglan is and what an appropriate planning response would be. A better understanding of the divergent views of submitters would assist in the development of provisions in relation to the historic heritage protection and the enablement of higher density residential development in particular. Thank you, sir. That's the notes that I prepared. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Coombs. I think what we might do is we might focus on the questions of character first, and the panel, I'm sure, have some questions around that, and we'll go around the panel one by one. And then I think once we've done that, we'll step into the other matters that are raised in the Section 42A report and have been addressed in submissions. I should also just note there's a few extra people joined since we started. Welcome, Ms. Parson, Ms. Greensills there. I think somebody on SB Computer. I'm not quite sure who SB Computer is, but if just so that we're aware of who's in the room, if the person on SB Computer could just please identify themselves, that would be helpful, please.
I can explain, sir, and I'll let Simon explain as well. Simon assisted me with the character study, so he's asked to just sit in on the hearing.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. I mean, it's a public hearing. Everyone's welcome. It's just like if we're out face to face, we often say people just identify themselves so we know who's in the room, and this is no different from that. So no, that's all fine. You don't need to introduce yourself any further, but we're now there, and welcome to the other submitters that have also just joined us. Let's just see the questions that we have on character. Mr. Cooney, I wonder if we could start with you, please.
Yes. Firstly, Ms. Salmon, can I just ask some questions of you and refer to your report? Just some general questions first. When your 42A report goes out, there's usually a note attached to them that we don't have to accept, the panel doesn't have to accept your recommendation. Did that go out with your report? Do you know? You're switched off at the moment.
Sorry. I don't actually know if that did go out.
Anyhow, but that's normally submitters are advised that the panel doesn't necessarily accept the 42A, doesn't have to accept the recommendation, and that's standard practice, isn't it?
Absolutely. I didn't realise that a notice needed to go out. Apologies for that.
Oh well, I'm not sure what your standard process is, so don't worry about that. But submitters who appreciate that, well, they may not accept your recommendation, so we better turn up and become involved.
Right.
And so that's the situation.
I see.
Yeah. Just on the workshop that was held to work through natural character or special character, how many people turned up?
In total, we had 33 people come to the meeting, to the workshop. Most of them were submitters. We had a few other people that heard about the meeting via other means, and they attended also. So a few people that weren't submitters also attended.
So that was about 32. Is that combined for both meetings or at each individual meeting?
We only had the one workshop.
Ah, I thought you had two workshops.
No, just the one workshop.
Oh, okay.
With submitters.
Okay. All right. Okay. And do you think they were representative of the Raglan community, those people that came to the workshop?
I think possibly not. It was obviously on a work day, so some of the submitters couldn't attend and give their views. I did offer them another option to provide views, but I didn't receive those.
Yeah.
So I think there is a possibility that the people at the workshop and possibly even the submitters are not representative of the community as a whole.
Yeah. Okay. And just on the submissions themselves, you got some submitters seeking general relief, and that's what really worried you, because it was too general. But yes, then there's other submissions, isn't there, that are more specific. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. And the legal position on the scope of submissions is that they don't have to specify with great particularity the relief they're seeking, and any relief that's granted has just got to be generally within the ambit of the submission. So there's not a strict approach taken, is there, in the consideration of the relief?
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
Where there, I guess where the submissions were quite extensive in terms of the relief sought. My concern around that was not really a scope issue. It was more about there wasn't an analysis to inform whether those whether the relief sought was a good option, whether that was going to have good outcomes. So that was what yeah, so it was the lack of specificity for the ones that really just stated that they wanted the character preserved. And on the other hand, the ones that wanted very extensive relief, it was more about that concern that there was probably quite a bit of analysis required if I were to recommend that that relief be supported.
Yeah. And a lot of those submissions, actually, a lot of them did focus on the town, on the town centre, didn't they?
Yes, some of them did.
Yeah. And that's why you went and got a special character report.
I did, because I guess it was really just to determine whether Raglan does have special character, and that's the starting point. As to whether I could contemplate supporting those submissions. Yeah,
and having received a report that says special character, I suppose the issue is, well, and this is what looms large in the whole of this hearing is, well, let's see how we deal with it. Let's see what we can do.
Yes.
And I just wanted to see if I can take you through some of the provisions, and I think other panel members might, to see if we can build on what actually we've got, rather than go off and get another report and have things delayed. And there's also another issue that does concern me, and I wonder whether you've given it some thought, is that this panel can't legally direct that a plan change be required. That's a policy decision of council. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I do understand that.
Yeah, and the same applies to a variation too. Once again, it's a policy decision, right? It's consideration, because politics change and council members change and all that, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
no, I do understand that.
Yeah, and there's no guarantee that if we just park this up, that that it'll eventuate. I'd like to think it would if we did, but given the political nature of things, it could well change, of course.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand the concerns of the panel and the submitters in that regard. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's why I think we really should try and look at what we got here in the plan at the moment and the submissions received and see if we can make it work. It may well be we can't, but I think we should try and explore that.
I think we have considered this prior to coming to the hearing. So we've given it some thought, and I guess we considered the pros and cons of some options. And those options, you know, some of them the options would mean that those submissions would be addressed as part of the scheduled process, whereas others would be outside, would be a subsequent process. I don't know if that would be helpful to the panel to hear the pros and cons of each, because that's
I don't think we need to do that at the moment. I think we just look at, see what you've got at the moment in the district plan and see whether it's possible to work on those. Is that okay?
I think, yeah. I think there's possibly some provisions that we could work on.
Yeah. I think the first one is, if we go to chapter 4, it's policy 4.1.18. Do you want wonder if we could, is that possible to bring that up, or is it too difficult, Sandra? In the district, in the proposed district plan.
Just bear with me for a minute.
It's the policy dealing with Raglan and character of towns.
Do you want the proposed plan, Paul?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Policy, what was it? Policy?
It was 4.1.18.
Okay.
Not there?
Yeah, just give me a minute. Is this under natural urban environment 4.1.18? Here it is.
Keep going. It's 4.
Here it is. I got it.
4.1.18.
Yeah, got it. I'll just share my screen just a minute. Here you go. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yep, thank you.
Ms. Seven, can you see that policy there?
Yes.
Yeah. That is one that, if you looked at the submissions that were received, you could build on that policy, couldn't you, to look at special character, and you couldn't say it's just special character. It's too vague. You'd have to have a better definition as to what we should ensure is achieved. Would you agree with that?
I don't know that I understand. Sorry.
Well,
Raglan, sorry.
That
Raglan,
policy there, what I'm suggesting is we could add to that policy to give recognition to special character attributes.
yes.
Yeah. And I don't want to do that myself because I'm not a planner, but I would imagine it's capable of defining some of the attributes that the report found.
Yeah. No, I think you could do that, but you would need to understand what the attributes are first.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I don't know that I have the full picture yet.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to change provisions at this stage. But yes, I do agree that you could add that into this policy.
Yeah. And then you've got policy 4.5.14. Sandra, could you bring that up? Policy 4.5.14.
Sandra, on that one, I wonder if Appendix 2 to the 42A report might be the better version to pull up, because there have been some suggestions that Ms. Salmon has made to that, and that will represent her sort of latest thinking on it as opposed to the notified version.
Yeah. Can you bring that up, Sandra?
Yeah, I'm just getting there, just one moment. What policy number?
It's Appendix 2 of the 40. It's Appendix 2 of the 42A report.
Okay, thank you. Okay, what page?
Yeah, that's it. That is the page. If you could just scroll that down a little bit though, please, so we can see all of it. That'll do.
Yeah. And I think I think, Ms. Salmon, that's a good example of you actually building on that policy there to give recognition to the special character of the town centre, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And okay. And if we look at the rest of the if we look at the rest of the plan provisions that cover the wider urban Raglan area, I think you've said you've got a height restriction on buildings of 7.5, which is really only 2-storey, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And there's setback rules for those buildings. They all control the scale of development in the town. Yeah. And for the multi-unit residential development, can you just answer a question on that? Are there areas for, apart from Rangatihi, are there areas set aside in Raglan for comprehensive developments?
Not specific areas is my understanding, but I understand that there's some work possibly within all the towns to identify areas for higher density development.
Yeah,
correct. There's nothing in the proposed district plan, although there was obviously the Kāinga Ora submission, which Mr. Stickney will talk to later, which is seeking medium density residential in Raglan amongst other areas.
Yeah. Okay. Is that to be considered in the zone extents or the boundary extents? Is that?
Well, that one's an interesting question. It's something we're working closely with Kāinga Ora, because of course that issue was first raised in the residential hearing, where we were talking about the provisions that to enable medium density residential, but obviously hand in hand is the actual physical extent of that. And so as a outcome of the residential hearing, Council is working closely with Kāinga Ora to establish the geographical area as well as the provisions. And that discussion and those workings are still going on.
Yeah, but just I'm like you, I couldn't find any areas set aside for comprehensive development at Raglan except for Rangatihi. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
There's just the general residential zone.
So what controls development at the moment in Raglan is the district-wide provisions, which I'm just referring to.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And for multi-unit developments, they are restricted discretionary, aren't they?
Yes, that's yes.
Yeah. Could you not add to that the matters to which the discretion is limited? Couldn't you add something there to recognise the special character of Raglan when you're looking at those developments?
Yes, I do agree that you could add that policies recognise the special character of Raglan. It's about what that special character actually is, and it's an understanding that beforehand, I guess, is what I'm trying to say before I actually, but yes, I do acknowledge that you could recognise that within this policy, and I think that would be appropriate.
See, Mr. Coombs, and we'll ask him later, he seems to say, well, it's about limiting development along the coast and the height of buildings, etc. And I think what I'm saying to you is, well, there is provisions already there to control development.
So I think when you talk about preserving that coastal edge, I think it's, yes, the general rules might be okay for the majority of Raglan, but possibly down near the coast, we want to preserve views specific to the coast, possibly to Karioi, it may be that it's more appropriate that you have one-story buildings, or that buildings are set back further than the general provisions provide for. So I do acknowledge that the bulk and location rules probably are appropriate for most properties in Raglan, but possibly not all.
Yeah, we do have the topographical issue that the whole of Raglan town sits on peninsulas, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it's really it's all looking at the coast, and it's all.
Yes.
What do you see as the coastal edge? What's your view of? Seems to me that the whole town is on the coastal edge.
I wouldn't say the coastal edge. I would say, you know, those houses that possibly front the coast are more at the edge, whereas houses that are set back into the town and not necessarily part of that coastal edge. And thinking about the general provisions too, I think the topography is has a lot of influence on lot size, for example. You know, it's not just the character, there's lots of things that influence, I guess, what's appropriate in terms of the general provisions for Raglan.
All right. And then the town centre itself has got restrictions on, or the buildings are limited to 10 metres, aren't they? And they're likely to be 2-story buildings.
Yeah. Yes, I think, and possibly again, when you're talking about the hotel, the name, the hotel within Raglan, I guess. So the general provisions, they protect the item itself, but they don't necessarily restrict development around those items, which might be appropriate, so that those, you know, in the example of the hotel, those items don't get built in.
Because the new buildings in the town centre, they're to meet not only the town centre guidelines, but also the character statement, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So there's some design measures in place already to protect that character of the township for any new buildings. Yeah,
I just don't know that it goes far enough. In the example that I've given about the hotel, yes, there are design guides around that.
But isn't that a heritage type thing?
Well, yes, but it is heritage, but it's also an attribute that you know, contributes to the character of Raglan as well.
Yeah. Okay. You in your report, I think at paragraph 125, you say there's no height on multi-unit developments, but I thought that it did apply. There's a height restriction on multi-unit in the town centre.
In the town centre.
Yeah. Anyhow, you can check that. I thought there is a 10 metre on multi-unit development as well. But you can check that and come back and advise on that. You mentioned in paragraph 125 of your 42A report.
125. I will check that and come back to you if that's okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, just from your perspective as a planner, do you not think that the topography, in other words, the way the town's built on the peninsulas and the town centre itself, in other words, the topography and the town centre, they're what define Raglan more than the outer township areas? What do you want to say about that?
When you say outer township areas,
well, the broader town
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is a lot of different batches and houses and so forth. And what I'm saying, would you like to comment on what defines Raglan really is the town centre and where it lies where the town lies within the wider topography?
I think that depends on your perspective, possibly not to mana whenua,
Yeah.
who seem to have a broader view of the character, and that encompasses district boundaries and property boundaries don't really exist when you look in that in terms of their perspective. So I guess it depends on your perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks.
I wonder if I might just be able to assist in relation.
Yeah, I'm going to come to you now. Yeah. No, but please go ahead, and you can add to that, Mr. Coombs.
Just that specific issue around the topography and the layout of the town on a series of peninsulas and headlands. We've got a very fortunate situation in that most of the coastal edge is fronted with public streets and all reserves. So in my view, that issue is around protecting that access to the coastal edge and the existing views that are there so that they don't get built out. So that was what I was referring to about the sort of sinuous coastal edge that's tree lined. Of course, there could be some additional protection added in to look after those trees in those public spaces and to make sure that more of that coastal edge doesn't get built out. But I agree with Ms. Salmon that for those more quantifiable and mappable issues, I think we're in a pretty good place of understanding them, but I think there's a wider conversation that needs to be had with mana whenua in particular.
Yeah, if we can just, thanks, Mr. Salmon on that. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Coombs, just looking at your special character report. What area are you defining here? To what extent is the area that you're looking at? You haven't defined it at all. And just reading between the lines, it seems to be the township, the town itself, and its surrounds. So, can you give us a bit of a steer on what you're referring to there?
Yeah, so we did attempt to do that in the workshop, and as predicted, we got quite different answers. So I think the nature of the submissions and the issues that were identified are quite specific to the urban area of Raglan Township. But of course, there's also a notion that Raglan Township might grow. So it might extend beyond its existing urban limits. But certainly the view of mana whenua is that we have a tribal landscape which is much broader than that and extends quite some way, both north and south, up and down the coast. And that's how Tainui see the local landscape as it's not constrained by urban boundaries or even district boundaries.
Yeah, but we have got other mechanisms to provide protections for those wider areas, don't we? In the plan, we've got significant natural areas, we've got landscapes, we've got Maori cultural sites and areas. So don't they fall for protection under all those provisions?
Certainly in terms of the physical attributes, that's absolutely correct. And I identified those intrinsic qualities, if you like, at the tail end of my earlier statement. And this sort of landscape relationship with Mount Kareoi, with the harbour and with the coastal edge. So those things would undoubtedly be protected by SNA type provisions. But there's another perceptual aspect here, the stories and the understanding of the landscape, which we just didn't have time to get into. It was alluded to at the workshop by the Tainui representatives that turned up, and there could be more stories to understand here, I guess. And I guess that's where this gets a little bit difficult, because it could be a reference or an explanation of what that means to Tainui. That is all that is required in terms of setting up how we look at that relationship. But it's not a typical sort of policy or rule type thing.
So you say in your executive summary that that the town is subject to district-wide provisions which do not fully protect its special character. And then in 3.1, under your review of the district plan, you say, in that you say, I'm trying to, until a comprehensive assessment of the character of Raglan is undertaken, it is not possible to identify if the district-wide provisions are wholly sufficient. Isn't that a little bit contradictory? You don't know. You're saying, well, I'm not sure whether they are or not. Shouldn't you have just looked at what I'm trying to do here? Shouldn't you have looked at those and see if you can make them work?
Yeah, so since then I've tried to sort of organise those aspects a little bit more, and that's the tail end of the statement that I read out earlier about splitting it out into intrinsic issues, sort of controllable issues under the district plan, which I think we can absolutely get a good handle on and probably assist with some updates to policies to help. And then there's the deeper conversation in particular with mana whenua. So there's some things we can fix here in a district plan sense. There's other things that I think need a deeper conversation.
You said before that the coastal margins around Raglan that you were talking about are already protected through the reserves and roading network. Is that what you've told us? Yeah.
Yeah, some of them are. There are other areas where residential development has sort of claimed that space on the coastal edge.
Yeah, but overall, that's the situation, is it?
Yes, yeah, and as I say, if Raglan grows, then we'd want to make sure that those public edges.
Well, why should they change? They're not a private land, are they? They belong to the council.
Oh, sorry, I mean in terms of any extensions to Raglan, urban areas.
And well, how do they change? Yeah, they're roads and reserves.
So for example, the Rangatahi development has been designed with a coastal reserve around the edge. You know, that's one of the characteristics of Raglan, that if there are any urban boundary extensions, then those sorts of attributes should be built in.
I'm just wondering how realistic it is to say to people in the wider area, look, you can't build more than one-story houses, or you can't. The design of a residential house must be this colour, or things like that. Just I think you get a pretty strong backlash, wouldn't you?
I hadn't thought about coming down to those sorts of specifics of provisions yet, but I imagine if you decided to restrict people to single level houses, then yeah, I'm sure you would get a backlash.
Well, that's what you seem to be saying, aren't you? In your summary statement, you seem to be suggesting those are the sort of things you do. If you look at page 2 of your summary statement, you say, and I'll read it to you, that's the middle paragraph. Specific to these attributes of character, patterns of future urban development could be required to respect the underlying topography, coastal edge, trees could be protected, the scale of development could be controlled, and the relaxed and informal character of the town could be protected through a relaxation in urban and road design standards. They're not, you know, if there are reserves and roads and the design of roads, they're not really subject to direct planning provisions, are they?
Well, I actually understand that this might have been an issue at Rangatahi, in that a fairly belt and braces approach to roading design was required by the plan, whereas there's other parts of Raglan that have a less formal character. So I'm not sure, and perhaps Ms. Salmon might be able to help me as to whether or not it's the Waikato District Engineering design guidance or what this that he used.
I guess so. Again, if you're talking about extending residential areas in Raglan, you want to ensure, I mean, if you're doing a subdivision and you're creating a road, probably maybe the general standards that are within the district plan aren't, they do require urban design of roads within urban areas, obviously, and maybe that's not appropriate in Raglan, because I guess if you want to respond to the informal character, I guess. So, I guess it's about if you're creating new roads rather than existing roads. And as Mr. Coombs points out, that was possibly an issue for the Rangitahi Peninsula subdivisions.
But I think as I discussed with Ms. Salmon, there's limited development potential in Raglan, except at Rangitahi at the moment. So the threat of development, more intense development, doesn't really loom large in Raglan, does it?
I mean, there is pressures for growth in Raglan. Whether this means that we're going to be opening up more land for residential activities, I don't know. But if you do, if we do, you know, within this planning horizon, then it's probably more appropriate that we do protect the character of Raglan when those subdivision applications come in. At least we have some teeth in the plan when we're assessing those subdivisions.
I'm a little bit intrigued, Mr. Coons, with your grain layout and scale. You've listed a lot of attributes there, and they are what exists now, or are topographical matters. But you, at the end, you say the built environment and building style is generally relaxed and unsophisticated, with more shacks and less formal development, reinforcing a quaint township character. You can't have, of course, planning provisions to build a shack, can you?
No, you can't.
No.
And one of the things that's kind of led to this character that we see at Raglan is a temporal component. There hasn't been a lot of development pressure. There are some individual areas where we've seen some larger buildings, which, you know, the community will have its view on. But generally speaking, the character is fairly laid back and less developed than other urban areas that we see in the Waikato district.
You heard and this is my final point. I've taken enough time, and I'm sorry about that. But if we use the existing provisions, and I've tried to take Ms. Salmon through those, or only some of them, but if we use the existing provisions in the plan, do you think you could help us to develop those provisions to recognise the special attributes of Raglan without going and getting another report? Do you think you could help us?
I think I can. I've taken a note of those policy numbers, Commissioner Kearney, so I'll have a deeper look at those. I've only seen them on the screen. For those aspects that I identified that can be controlled by district plan provisions, I think absolutely. I think we can reflect the character that we've unearthed already, if you like. But I still think, particularly around this mana whenua discussion, I think there's more conversations to be had there. You know, it was something that came out really strong at the workshop, and as you'll be aware, sir, you can't rush those discussions.
All right. Thanks very much, both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Kearney. I should just say, for the benefit of those submitters that are sort of waiting in the queue, if I could put it that way, is we're not time constrained today. We've always signalled that we need to take as much time in the questioning of the council folk in particular to make sure that we explore what needs to be explored. And I think that the line of questioning that Mr. Cooney's asked, for example, whilst it's extensive, it is sort of getting to the nub of the issue on that character issue. So we'll just have to be a bit patient, because I think the rest of the panel may also have some questions on this topic, because it is key to not everybody that's here today, but certainly a number of them. So I think we'll move now to Ms. Sedgwick, please.
Thank you. Mr. Cooney, yes, you were very extensive in your questions, and I was busy ticking them off as you went. A couple of points. Firstly, I'd like to address to Ms. Salmon. I have trouble with words which are which are more emotive than definitive. And I note in your recommended amendments for the town centre, you talk about eclectic and artistic, and those things can mean many things to many people, and that would concern me as a policy without everybody being very clear what those words were to mean. So essentially, I think I'm following the same track as Mr. Cooney here. You mentioned about the relief, the submitters and the relief that they sought. And I tended to be a little confused with that, because I had seen some of them very specifically, such as the not wanting to have two-storey buildings on corners. And so I would be interested in how more specific would they need to be to cause you to reflect on that?
Shall I respond to the first question? Yeah, I take your point in terms of wordings that are probably subjective, like artistic and eclectic. I took those straight from the design guides. Yeah, I guess, and that came from the submission from Kāinga Ora, who wanted to incorporate the outcomes of the design guides into the policies. So yeah, I think I could have given that a bit more thought, and yeah, I do agree. I also don't really like waffly words, for want of a better word, especially in terms of implementation. So it possibly might be more helpful if there were introductions to our towns that sat within the district plan. I don't know if this is within scope or not, but possibly that would talk about the artistic and eclectic characteristics of Raglan, rather than putting that into the policy, and then the policy talks about, I can't recall the wording, whilst promoting the special character of the town, I guess might be something that's more, as you say, definitive. So I do take your point on that.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want me to have a think about that and possibly reword that. Is that what you're...
I think we'll get to the end of the hearing and there'll be a where to from here. I think we can signal right now that I think closing the hearing at the end of today is extremely unlikely. Is that we're going to go away and reflect on what we've heard today, and then we'll come back with what we consider to be an appropriate set of next steps.
Okay.
It may involve redrafting of some matters. It may involve something else. We haven't formed any view on that. We've got a completely open mind. But I think just from the conversation that we've heard today, it's almost certain, and we haven't heard from the submitters yet either, it's almost certainly something that's going to benefit from some further thinking and interaction with folk, but we don't know what form that'll take yet. So let's not worry too much about putting band-aids on on things as an immediate reaction. Let's look at the big picture at the end of the day.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, so my second question was that that degree of specificity that you were looking for from submitters, so maybe it helps submitters to understand, and using as an example where submitters said, paraphrasing, we want only single stories on corners, and yet we talk about 2 stories on corners for reasons which you do elaborate on quite well. I just was concerned about the balance of that, how you achieved that end result when it appeared to be at odds. So that was a point that concerned me.
I think when I was talking about the lack of specificity, it was in relation to the submissions that sought protection of the character of Raglan, full stop, nothing else was mentioned. When submissions sought that corner buildings or buildings within the town centre, either 1 story or 2 story, I think I did address that, and I think I did put my reasoning behind why I rejected those submissions.
I'll go back and reread that one. Thank you. A question from Mr. Coombs. I always get a little worried when I hear somebody say, I didn't have time to get into it. And I think that may have sort of put a flag in my mind. I wondered whether you consider 1 workshop with 32 people.
I thought I'd just run through where I think we've got to, because obviously.
Sorry, who's?
I think that's someone that's joined the meeting and didn't have themselves fully muted. I think that was a distraction.
Right, sorry. It's a point rather than a question, but it draws on Commissioner Cooney's comments of quite a small number of people are telling you what they think the character is. And I'm struggling to work out, is it the town centre? Is it the bigger part? Is it all of Raglan? Is it the coast? And you replied to Commissioner Cooney with that, but it is something that I consider to be an area of concern. And I just wanted to note that with you.
Thanks, Ms. Cedric. Ms. Tiaho?
Well, kia ora koutou. Yeah, look, I think I get the sense from the other commissioners questioning that there's, you know, we acknowledge the strong desire of the submitters to protect the existing character, but the challenge has really been, how do we define that in a really specific way that doesn't cause interpretation problems down the track for somebody else? And really looking for ways that we can build on what's in the notified version and in the appendix to the reporting officer's revised report. Given that there was a diversity of views about what the special character actually means, and as Commissioner Cedric has said, how far, which particular part of Raglan, or is it the whole thing? And then what is the appropriate planning response to all of this? Those are the challenges that we face. And so I guess the chair has indicated that there's going to be more work to be done after this as we look at ways, because I think that all of the submitters mentioned character. It came through in every single one. And I think that we have to do more to find ways to find mechanisms or specific wording that's helpful, that gives respect to the time and effort that all of the submitters and the people of Raglan have gone to attend those workshops, to make their submissions. You know, often they're lay people. They aren't going to be able to have the words and the mechanisms. That's the planners' jobs, in my view. So yeah, I just think that just to build on those questions that have been asked and the discussions that we've had this morning, I agree that there's going to need to be more work to be done to reflect the submissions that have come in.
Thanks, Ms. Tiaho. I've got some questions as well, and I'd like to take a view from the opposite end of the spectrum from what Mr. Cooney asked you about. Mr. Cooney focused very strongly on, well, we've got some notified provisions, and what is it that we can do with those in terms of strengthening them to address the matters that have been raised. And I think that's been a very helpful conversation. I'd like to understand from both Ms. Salmon and Mr. Coons that if we were to embark upon either a plan change or a plan variation, which are effectively the same process other than in respect of timing, what you would envisage being involved in that exercise, what advantages that might have over the sort of process that Mr. Cooney has described, and what you might anticipate being involved in doing it. I know you've neatly kicked for touch and said it's potentially quite complicated, but I'd like to understand that if we went down that route, what it might look like, and how much of that would involve expert judgment. I get the very strong sense, and I think it would accord with what I would understand the situation to be. I think addressing those cultural landscapes is something that can only be informed by consultation, and that is a process that needs to be carefully considered and mapped out. But in terms of what you might call the Western cultural view of character, there's some pretty clear views emerging about what might need to be done in that space. And I guess I'm posing the question that if you were to undertake a plan change or a plan variation, and you put the mana whenua aspects to one side, and I just use that term loosely, and you're looking at the architectural and sort of visual aspects of character, how hard would that be? And how much of it would be expert opinion, and how much of it would be someone having a go at it and letting everybody else fire arrows at it, because these things are inherently subjective and people will have different views. So that's a very rambly question. But I would just welcome your views, individually or collectively, on how you might see that panning out.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of those attributes that we've identified that can be measured and interpreted, I think we could have a go at looking at the notified provisions. Yeah. I guess, yes, possibly just at a planner level. I guess there's the concern about thinking about, are these submitters representative of the whole community? Possibly not, so it would go out.
That's what a Schedule 1 process would be designed to address, because the challenge in doing anything to these notified provisions by way of strengthening them or changing them is that it's fine for the people that have made submissions, but there may well be a whole range of people that have chosen not to make submissions because they read the submissions of others and said, oh, they're pretty general, I don't really feel I need to get involved in that. But if all of a sudden you're saying, houses on the main street can only be of a certain type or whatever else, then you may well find that there's as Mr. Cooney alluded to, that there's quite a lot of concern and so forth expressed. And that's why I want to explore a little bit more about, if we did follow a Schedule 1 process, how you might see the steps involved in that panning out and how long you think it might take.
From my perspective, I think that landscape assessment that was undertaken by ISMIS, and they were not asked to identify those specific elements that could go into a district plan. So they are very broad from my understanding, the elements that have been identified as contributing to character. Now I think that not all of those will be appropriate or to be addressed in the district plan. So to my mind, I think there's another level of detail that needs to go, and Mr. Coombs can talk to this. What are the specific, okay, so we've got some broad elements. What are the specifics that can and should be addressed through a district plan, and then how? So I think there's two things. If we did, and you're right, if we tweaked the provisions now, I get the feeling that they would be quite broad. There might be a policy and perhaps some assessment criteria, but they certainly wouldn't and can't at the moment go down to should the maximum height be single story, for instance. I don't think that that the analysis has been done to that level yet. So I think that there's another couple of steps. There seems to be another drilling down into that character and saying, okay, what is appropriate to be addressed in the district plan, and then taking that and turning that into provisions to then go out to the community and saying, okay, this is actually what it might mean to you on the ground.
What does the operative plan have to say about Raglan's character? And put Rangatahi to one side, because it's got its own set of provisions. But in terms of Raglan Town Centre, the Raglan Coastal Fringe and so forth, what's the operative plan have to say about that?
The operative plan is fairly silent on those matters. There's broad recognition of the coastline in Raglan, and that's really it in the operative district plan. That's my understanding. So
that's what I thought. That's fine. Look, I suppose the question that I've got, and this will be my last one, I think, on this character issue. I know this isn't a resource consent application. It's a proposed district plan, but it's sort of like a resource consent application insofar as this is the council's proposal for how it sees things being managed within its district. So it's not site specific, but it's region specific. And if this were a resource consent application, the applicant would make its proposal. People would have the opportunity to make submissions, and folk like us would make decisions on it. And in making those decisions, we would do one of two things. We'd say, or one of three things. We'd say, is the information that's in front of us sufficient to make a decision simply and straightforwardly? Second of all, we might say, well, there are some gaps in what we've heard. Can it be conditioned? Can you put conditions? And in this, if you draw the analogy further, the conditions here would be more objectives, more policies, more character statements, more rules, more something or others in the district plan. And in all of those cases, the onus is on the proponent, the resource consent applicant, to make that case out. It's not the submitter's job, as Mr. Cooney said, or Ms. Sedgwick said, to sort of make the council's case for it. Their job's to say, this is what we think is the problem with what needs to be done, and we want decision makers to address that. And then the third option, and that is to say, well, this proposal hasn't been well enough considered. There aren't matters that we think that we can just impose conditions on, so we'll decline the consent application. And I know it's not a literal comparison between a district plan and a resource consent application, but the concern that I have as the chair of this hearing is that what the council's effectively asking us to do is to make a non-decision on something that creates a whole bunch of, quotes, rules, and I use that term loosely, regarding the future of this town, fully acknowledging that it's incomplete and we haven't done our job properly because there's a big gap in things. So in section 32AA terms, how could we come to that decision? Simply all that would be in front of us would be an acknowledgement that says we can't address this issue adequately. And that sort of leaves a bit of a sort of hollow feeling in my stomach, because we're charged with making decisions that result in a district plan that's enduring. And all we're really doing here, at best, is kicking for touch. And that's why I'm asking the questions around what would be involved in future processes, because we're not issuing any decisions on any aspect of the district plan until we've finished our hearings. We've also, and that includes the section that's only recent, well, hasn't yet, I don't think it's been notified, the natural hazards aspects. So we're going to still be having hearings in the middle of next year. So if we were to say, look, the council needs to pull its finger out and address this issue. It's been doing its district plan process for quite a number of years. This issue's been live for a long time. It's only in the last, few months that expert advice has been sought from Mr. Coombs. He's done what he can in the time available, which is to say, yeah, it's got some character and here's some things that you might need to think about. Why wouldn't we send the council away to say, go and get this sorted out, do whatever you need to do, notify something new, and we'll have a hearing later on in the process towards the end of the process that we're going through. And I'm being really directive in the way that I say that, simply so that there's no doubt in anyone's mind what I'm saying, which is not to say that's the view that we have formed. And that's just the other end of the spectrum from the one that Mr. Cooney expressed. So I'm saying, asking the council, why could it not progress down a Schedule 1 process now, do the work, seek submissions? Mr. Lawson, for example, might say, well, I think that's an absolute load of codswallop. Ms. Parson might say the same thing. They'd make their submissions, but they'd have something tangible to look at. We'd have something tangible to review, and then we could make an informed decision. So my question to you is that if we went down that track, how realistic is it to be in a position 12 months from now that we were having this conversation with a set of complete plan provisions in front of us, rather than adjourning it sort of sine die for the council to maybe do something as a priority, but for all the reasons that we're aware of, might never happen. Sorry, again, that's a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted you to be very clear what my proposition was.
Yeah, no, I completely understand where the panel are coming from, and I appreciate those views. And of course, I had those views myself when I was addressing those submissions, and discovered that, of course, indeed, Raglan does have character, but that, rejecting them, even though I support them in principle.
Oh, and we make no criticism of the people that have prepared the reports. It simply is what it is. And you've been tasked with doing a job, and you've done that to the best of your ability. And we imply no criticism of you or Mr. Coombs in that. So I just want to be clear on that as well.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And taking what Carolyn has said previously about, I guess, if we are going to move forward with this, we still would need to, we've got the broad elements that make up the special character, but we still don't necessarily understand the specific elements that contribute to its character. So as she says, there is some more groundwork to do in that regard. And I guess my only concern is if we progress this through a variation, is do we have funding and resourcing, and are we going to be able to meet those deadlines? And I guess that's really my only concern about whether this is a variation versus a plan change.
What's your thinking? I mean, bearing in mind that when a plan is notified or a plan change is notified, it doesn't have to have 100% community support, because inevitably it never will. That's why we have submission processes and hearings like this. And I suspect that even if you took 10 years of solid work to prepare, whether it be a structure plan or whatever else you did for Raglan, you'd have submissions in opposition to some or all of it. So, I mean, you can analyse it till the cows come home, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't develop a robust proposal that you think, you being the council family, thinks is defensible in Section 32 terms, such that you're prepared to propose it. And I guess it doesn't seem to me that that necessarily involves a hugely complicated, long-winded process. It may in respect of some of the mana whenua issues, but that's not to say that you can't make a start on those aspects and see where they end up. And as I say, I'm not suggesting this is the course of action that should be taken, but I'm trying to understand from the council folk here that if we did go down that track, is it achievable or isn't it? Because the last thing we'd want to do is to embark on a process that we couldn't conclude, because then everyone would lose faith in the process that we've done. But my starting proposition would be, I can't see why, if you backtrack from a hearing in the middle of next year through the notification steps and say that that would mean that by about the end of this year you'd have to notify a variation, something in that sort of order, then why that would not be achievable. So that's the proposition.
Wouldn't mind inviting Will to respond to this one, because we've done a lot of thinking about, because this is not just one process, there's a whole lot of other ones.
And that's accepted, I understand.
Good morning, Commissioners. For those who've tuned in, my name's Will Gauntlet. I'm working with Carolyn, Summer and Sandra on the District Plan Review. My role there is the District Plan Manager. So I have joined the hearing largely as an observer today, but I'm happy to join in this conversation or other conversations as need be. And I agree and understand all the conversation that's been happening, particularly around this idea of getting something through this plan review process. And I agree that that would be a successful outcome. The hesitation I have, and it might be interesting to hear from the other submitters a bit later, is we could, as you've suggested, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell, that we could put a policy, pull something together and put it out and use the public process to test that. Waikato District Council, and I know some community members might have different views, but Waikato District Council really respects the relationship with the Raglan community, and we'd want to make sure that through any policy development process that we engaged with them adequately through that. And in my view, the relationship with that community through that process is as important as the policy outcomes that would come from it. And I guess that would lead on to a question you might have, well, could you get a consultant in to manage this process to get past the resourcing issues that we currently have in terms of all of our focus being on the district plan hearings? And again, my view would come back to, we'd want those relationships and that institutional, those institutional relationships to remain with council staff. And I'd want to make sure that it was council staff that were engaging with the community in the development of any policy.
I think we would endorse those sentiments, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question of saying, is it achievable that by about the end of this year or early next year, the council could do a robust job of developing some provisions that did have that element of conversation with people. My suggestion or my proposition wasn't saying do this behind closed doors and the first time that anybody would see it be when things were notified. I wasn't suggesting that. But I was saying that you can have consultation, but that doesn't necessarily result in agreement. And in something like this, it almost inevitably wouldn't, I wouldn't have thought. So I guess the question that I'm posing for council as a whole is whether, bearing in mind what Mr. Gauntlet has said, is it realistically achievable to propose a robust variation to this plan in 6 to 8 months from now? And we'll ask the submitters when it's their turn whether how they would see that process working and whether they would see that having any merit. in the same way that we will also ask them to comment on the other end of the spectrum about what it is that we could do to the existing provisions to make them more fit for purpose than they currently are, even if that doesn't go the whole hog. So I want to reiterate, we're not taking you down this path and saying this is the way to go. We're saying that if we were to go down that path, is it doable and is it achievable? And I'd like a yes/no answer to that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yes. The steps that are required to achieve that are doable within that time frame. The challenge I imagine we would have is outlining the resource and cost required and getting our elected members to prioritise that amongst, as you can imagine, a number of other priorities, particularly those that are coming out the back of the COVID-19 economic recovery work and getting that achieved now.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair point to make. I mean, and the last thing we want to do is impose burdens on ratepayers or the council that are just unsustainable. So that is relevant, and I'm glad you raised it. So I don't think we need to explore. On the same
page in that we agree there's character. We agree that there might be some things we can do through the current plan, but possibly not achieve everything and ensure everyone's views are at the table. So therefore a subsequent process would make sense. Whether we can achieve enough now to protect the character while we were to prioritise another Schedule 1 process in the future might be a bit of a win-win, or a sort of a not going all the way but not doing nothing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Mr. Gauntlet, too, is that, once this, if the marketplace knew there was some character controls, if we want to call it that, in the wind, and there's some operative provisions that might be seen as being a bit more permissive than what might be coming, you could end up with some unsatisfactory outcomes in the short term, at least potentially.
Yes.
Mr. Gauntlet, do I take it from what you've just described that, and it's the point I made earlier, that this, whether there's a variation or plan change, is entirely a political decision, and it may well be council politicians or the political wing of council may say, nah, we got more important things to do here, and we're not prepared to prioritise this variation. Is that what you seem to be saying?
That's largely correct, Mr. Kearney. So we would, staff would prepare a report and either workshop that or present that to the elected members. So in the process of constructing that report, staff would put themselves in the position of what the elected members may be thinking, that high-level district-wide priorities. So I imagine the report we took wouldn't simply say we need X amount of money and X amount of resource to do this for Raglan. We would need to take a big picture approach and structure the report in that way, and then seek the elected members' views from that perspective. Okay. So we have a number of other live issues, I suppose, throughout the district that will need in time a plan variation or a plan change. And so in my mind, this is something that needs to be prioritised against those things. And then, as I've just alluded to, the changing landscape we now are in with the COVID recovery.
So
probably a prophetic choice of words, with the changing landscape.
Yeah. We're sort of left, the panel's left in a difficult position here, isn't it? There can't be any guarantees from what you're saying that a variation would be promoted by council or any plan change. So we're left with a bit of a problem as to how we address any gaps, don't we? Is that seems to be the outcome?
I'd say it's fair to say that we're all left in a difficult position because of that situation. It's It's the nature of the framework and structure in which we work.
And COVID.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's been a really helpful discussion. We've only addressed that part of the section 42A report that deals with character. And we do have some other matters that we want to raise, including things relating to the navigation beacon. So Ms. Wheeler, we haven't forgotten about, Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler, we haven't forgotten about that. And there are a number of other things that we'd like some clarity on. What I think we might do is that we might adjourn now for a quarter of an hour. We'll come back at 11 o'clock on the second meeting request. I think everyone should have a copy of that. It'll be a different login to this particular one. I'm pretty confident that we'll make time up as we go, but we're not constrained by time particularly. And we did indicate that all the timing was indicative. And we'd rather have this conversation with the staff and in daylight with everybody listening to it than trying to jam it into a very short space of time and people saying, well, panel really didn't take much notice of this, that, or the other thing. So we apologise if we're causing people to be a bit more delayed than they otherwise might have thought, but that's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So unless anyone has anything they need to raise with us now, we'll adjourn until 11 o'clock. And if anyone can't or doesn't have the link to the meeting, that's the second one, if they could contact Ms. Kelly and she could resend that to them if they've somehow mislaid it. So if the panel could just wait for a minute, but if everybody else could please log off, if we could stop the recording, and we'll see you back at 11 o'clock. If Ms. Greensell and Ms. Kerman could leave, that would be appreciated, please.
Sorry, I'm trying to just get out of this. Hang on.
That's right. Okay. I think if you click on your screen, you should see a little red button with white writing somewhere that says leave or